Hello and welcome to Small Group Leadership Training. My name is Joe Stearns. I'm a minister with the Broward Church, and today's topic is the purpose of small groups. I have a subtitle for this. It is the congregational theory and strategy for small groups. So this lesson is geared towards church leaders, ministers, and eldership, deacons, whoever is responsible for the overall program of small groups in your congregation. I think and hope that any leader or anyone listening to this could benefit, but it's geared towards congregational leaders. So some initial thoughts are that when you implement small groups in your church, these are matters of judgment. You're not really trying to decide between right and wrong, but what is a best practice. And so you're going to have a lot of choices about your small group program, and whether you're rolling out a new program or considering redesigning what you do with your small groups, I hope this list of choices will be helpful to you in your thinking and your planning. Now, we're attempting to do an exhaustive list of those choices, but there's probably some issues that we failed to consider. I apologize for that up front, but I do hope that as we go through this list of choices, it'll be helpful to you. We are going to conclude with where we landed in the Broward Church in our use of small groups, not because we think we necessarily have arrived at the ideal situation, but it's just our position. We're going to present it for your consideration. So one of the first list of choices, this is a busy slide, but it's busy on purpose, and that is that you have a lot of choices. So in choices for the purpose of your small group, one of the questions you can ask is, what does the group gather around? Either literally or figuratively speaking, is the primary purpose of the small groups in your church? Is it Bible study? Is it Bible discussion? That's been the case for us. That has been a primary focus in the past. Is it primarily for friendship? This is a very powerful and important idea. Do you want the members of your congregation, so that they don't fall through the cracks, do you want them to gather in small groups in a place where they can know others and they can be known? That can be a purpose of your small groups. It could be discipleship. It could be that you want the primary purpose to be outreach, to be evangelism. Is it community service? Is it life station or special interest? Now, what I mean by life station is the primary purpose of your group to be a subsector of the church. For example, is it for the teens? Is it for the campus? Is it for young marrieds? Is it for empty nesters? Is it for marrieds with children, where you talk about parenting? These are examples of life station. Or do you want your group to be outreach for special interests? Do you want to have soccer groups, pottery groups, yoga groups? Do you want to have special interests? Do you want to have it multi-purpose, where the real purpose of the small group is doing life together, where your group could do a lot of different things, but the purpose is to go through life together with the other members of your small group? Do you want to reproduce worship? There are congregations where a small group gathering will have music, it'll have singing, some groups will do the Lord's Supper, communion together. They'll have prayer together. Do you want to reproduce what is typically done in a Sunday worship service? Do you also want that in your small group? And last, it kind of mirrors the life station idea. Do you want the book club theme? I've seen this somewhat frequently. Do you want the group to gather around an area of study, in particular a book that you're reading? Now, I'm going to give you several choices as a leadership that you'll need to make with your small groups. There's going to be some overlap with this list, but you'll see what I mean. There's some choices you need to make. So one of them is, do you want your groups to be open or closed? And what I mean by that is, do you want the membership to be set, Or do you want the groups to have a position of accepting new members into their small group? There's a lot of congregations where, for example, 8 people or 10 people will decide we're going to be in this small group, and they do not accept new members. So that's a choice you have right there. So another choice is, do you want the group to exist for a certain time period or to be open-ended in how long the group runs? And do you want some kind of covenant, contract, pact with the group? For example, there are churches that will take 8 or 10 people, close the group, and then they'll have a pact to go for a year and a half where they make this group a high priority. They're going to attend it. They're going to build friendships within that group. Or you could have the groups open-ended. What characterizes our congregation is groups that have sometimes lasted 10 years, 20 years long. They form a little sub-family within the larger congregational family. So that's a decision you have. Do you want your group to go a year or 2 or 18 months, or do you want it to be open-ended? And also, do you want some kind of covenant for the group? Another choice is, do you want to have a leader of your group, or do you want to have a facilitator? Now, the distinction here is that the leader views themselves as leading the group, where a facilitator does not view themselves as the leader of the group. They simply are trying to facilitate the process of the group meeting. And so it's a step away from having a full-blown leader. Another choice that you have is, how much congregational guidance do you want to give to your small groups? How much control does the congregational leadership want to have? For example, do you want your small group leaders or facilitators to plan the lesson themselves? Or do you want the congregation to plan a lesson and disperse it to all your small group leaders? Do you want to decide what the groups are going to do when they get together, or do you want the groups to decide for themselves what they want to do? So there's a decision on how much congregational guidance you want for your small groups. Are your small groups going to be evangelistic? Is it simply for the members of your church, or do you want it to have a function, either a primary function or one of the functions of the group is outreach to help people who are not Christians to become Christians? Is that a part of your group function? Now, another issue is, do you want the group primarily to be about life station, or do you want the group to primarily be geographic? So you could have everybody in a particular neighborhood or in a particular suburb, no matter what their life station, they get together. And so that's often going to lend to a multi-generational group where you might have older people, you might have younger people, and your goal is really to have a geographical gathering. And that's kind of as opposed to having groups that get together for parenting, or groups that get together as a campus group or a teen group or whatever that is. So that's a decision for your congregation to make. And the last thing I had on this list of decisions for you to consider is, do you want your small groups to be congregation-wide, or do you want it to be a small subsector of what your church membership does? For example, in the Broward Church, we have asked everyone who's a member of our church to find a community group, and we're probably at about 85 to 90% of our membership is involved in small groups. We consider it a primary way of organizing our congregation. That's a decision for you. Do you want it to be congregation-wide, or just one of many options of involvement for the members of your church? Now, another decision you'll need to make is, what are you going to recommend for the monthly rhythm of your small groups? I'm going to give you some examples. If you have a small group that revolves primarily around Bible study, then week number 1 of the month could be Bible study. And we haven't talked about food yet, but a decision you want to make is, do you want to encourage your small groups to frequently have meals together, or is that not something you want to focus on? So in our congregation, For groups that are primarily about Bible study, it's Bible and food. They usually have a meal together. It's usually more than snacks. It's a potluck dinner, and then they have their Bible study. So you might have every week of the month is Bible study, except that every now and then you work in a special event, either a fun event or a discipleship group or service in the community. That's a rhythm for you to consider. Now, if the primary goal of your group is doing life together, then one week you might have Bible study, the next week you might have a D group, you might circle back to Bible study. One week out of the month you might do something that's a service activity or a fellowship activity together. So that's a possible rhythm that you can encourage for your groups. What if you have groups where there's a lot of small children? Here's a suggested rhythm. You only meet once a month for everybody together because of the burden of childcare. And then during the month, you can have the men get together while the women watch the kids and have a discipleship group. You can have a week off because when you're working and you're raising kids, it's probably one of the busiest times of your life. So the rhythm of the small group might be less demanding for parents of small children than for other members of the church. But the men can meet one time, and then 2 weeks later, the women get together and the men watch the children. And a last option for you to consider is if you have a group that revolves primarily around community service, they could do community service every single week of the month, or they could do community service and mix it in. Even though their primary focus is community service, they could mix in some Bible study, they could mix in some discipleship, they could do fun events together from time to time. So that's something you would decide is, if your groups are focused on service, how is it 100% of that group's activity, or do they also have other types of fellowship? Another decision for you to make, you can see there's a lot of choices here, is how do you want to do your leadership training? So do you want to have regular meetings for your leadership training? For example, our congregation meets via Zoom once a month. It's the first Friday of every month. Actually, the second Friday of every month. We meet via Zoom. That's our training meeting. Do you want to develop your own curriculum, your own topics for leadership training, or do you want to outsource it? Do you want to use YouTube videos? Do you want to work through a book on small groups? And here's a question for you. Do you want to have paid staff? Can your congregation afford full-time paid staff that just focuses on small groups? Many congregations are finding that the importance of the small group greatly benefits the health of the church. So if you have the budget for it and you consider that a priority, that's something for you to consider. Do you want full-time paid staff focusing on your small groups? Now, I wanted to conclude just letting you know where the Broward Church has landed. Once again, I don't think we necessarily have the ideal setup, and we're actually, periodically, we debate how we're doing our small groups to see if there's anything that we want to change in our small groups. But here's where we're at right now. Our mission statement for our small groups is to build community and to reach community. And so what we mean by that is we want to build community within the small group. We want to build friendships. We want to build discipling within the group itself. And then we want that group to not only have an inward focus, but to also have an outward focus. And so when we say reach community, we mean both evangelism and community service. And so we've named our small groups community groups. And as many of you know, there's a lot of different names that you can use for your small groups. Bible talks, family groups. One group is called them cells, like a cell of the body. There's a lot of names you can choose. We chose community groups because it speaks to our congregational mission statement for the small groups. Now, we do practice open membership and an open time period. People can join an existing group, and the groups are open-ended. We don't have term limits for our small groups. Now, we gather around multiple foci. You like that fancy college word? Multiple focuses for the group. So we do not have our small groups only focused on the Bible or only focused on evangelism. The overall picture of our small groups is doing life together. And so we rotate through these different things in a typical month. In a typical month, a group might have 2 Bible discussions and 2 discipleship groups. And maybe if there's a 5th week in the month, they might rotate in a service activity, feeding the poor, serving the elderly, or a fellowship, a fun activity that the group can do together. We are encouraging congregation-wide involvement in our small groups, and we are flexible on whether the groups are geographically centered or whether they're life station centered. We are trying for the future in our particular congregation to encourage more and more geographic groups that are multi-generational, but we still have groups that are meeting for campus or groups that are meeting for singles or parents with children. So we're flexible on that. And we encourage having a leader rather than a facilitator because we encourage a certain element of shepherding. We want the leader to have a concern for the members of the group, pray for the group. Most small group leaders are not in the full-time ministry, of course, so we don't expect them to give thorough shepherding, but we want an element of that rather than a facilitator. Right now, our groups are fairly highly guided. Most of the group leaders are allowed to choose their own lesson, to create their own lesson, but we provide a lesson for them if they want to use that. And in practice, most of the small group leaders are using our guided lesson. They have the option to create their own, but most of them are using our lesson. We do encourage the groups to be evangelistic, and we have not attempted to have our small group meetings to be a reflection of the Sunday service. Most of our small group meetings do not have singing or communion together. That's an option, but it's just where we landed that we're not attempting to do that right now. I know these are a lot of decisions to face, but our hope and prayer for you is that your small group ministry will be a great blessing to your church. Thank you for your time.